Coming up on Bridge City News, the Alberta government announces more financial help is on the way for childcare centres. Premiers meeting in Ottawa are requesting millions more to help with healthcare costs related to the COVID-19 pandemic. And we hear from a couple of Albertans who walked across the province to raise awareness and funds to support those battling Crohn's and colitis.
Your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News with Hal Roberts.
Thanks so much for joining us. The Alberta government announced today that licensed childcare programs will be receiving a funding boost. Minister of Children's Services Rebecca Schultz says the $87 million initiative will help childcare centres, preschools, and approved family day homes continue to keep children safe during the coronavirus pandemic.
Childcare programs have already begun to receive the September support of $109 per licensed space. This is the third phase of funding that we committed to this spring and have started to roll that funding out to centres across the province. They will now receive $200 per space plus a $2,500 grant per childcare centre in both October and November through this grant we're announcing today.
Schultz says these grants will help operators buy additional cleaning supplies, safety equipment, and other upgrades necessary to comply with health guidelines without increasing parent fees. Members of Alberta's legislature will resume sitting on October 20th. Government House Leader Jason Nixon says it is a week earlier than planned to, quote, get back to the critical work of protecting Albertans and building our province for the future. The UCP said it would bring forth legislation to keep election platform commitments on electoral reform and renewal. It says it will also continue to deliver policies to build infrastructure, diversify Alberta's economy, and create more jobs. MLAs last sat when the spring sitting ended in late July. Manitoba Premier Brian Pallister told reporters that we cannot go on like this after meeting with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in Ottawa yesterday. The Liberal government has given provinces $19 billion to respond to COVID-19, but the premiers of Manitoba, Alberta, Ontario, and Quebec want to see an additional $28 billion each year for health care. Alberta Premier Jason Kenney says the pandemic has really taken its toll on Albertans.
Provincial taxpayers are carrying nearly 80% of the burden in a system that becomes more costly as our population ages. And that is more clear now than ever in the midst of the worst public health crisis in a century. We all say during COVID that we need to be all in this together. And while we do appreciate many of the recent actions of the Government of Canada, fundamentally, as my colleagues have pointed out, our ability at the provincial level to pay for the quality of care that people rightfully need and expect is increasingly limited.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said he will discuss the potential of more funding at a First Ministers meeting later this fall. A Calgary hospital continues to work to contain COVID-19 outbreaks that were identified over the weekend. Alberta Health Services announced that 14 patients and 4 staff tested positive for the novel coronavirus at the Foothills Medical Centre. One of the patients died from the virus. The outbreaks are in 2 cardiac care units and 1 general medicine unit. Officials say they do not appear to be connected to each other. The health agency says 57 staff who work in the cardiac and general medicine units were in isolation. A Lethbridge police officer was injured during a training accident on Tuesday morning. Police say the officer was taken to hospital and is now recovering. The Director of Law Enforcement was notified of the incident, and the Alberta Serious Incident Response Team was called in to investigate. It is day 2 of the trial of pediatrician Ramneek Kumar, who is charged with sexual assault and sexual interference involving a 9-year-old girl in August of 2015. The child was not a patient, and the alleged assault occurred during a vacation in Waterton Lakes National Park. BCN's Naveen Day was at the Lethbridge Courthouse today and has the latest.
Yesterday and today, the girl, now 14 years old, spent 2 half days on the stand giving her account of the alleged events that took place while her and her family were on vacation with the Kumars. She alleged that on the first day of vacation, there were 3 separate incidents in which Dr. Kumar came up from behind her and began massaging and touching her hair, back, and chest. The next day of vacation, she told the court that Kumar offered to take the children in the group, including herself, to visit a nearby pool. There is where he insisted that she change in the same change room as was used by the male attendees. While in the change room with Kumar, the girl alleged that he groped her 2 more times and told her not to tell anyone. Kumar's trial is set to run until tomorrow.
That was video journalist Naveen Day reporting from the Lethbridge Courthouse. Walking for a cause, we've seen and heard it many times before. Two Albertans walked across Alberta to raise funds and awareness for those who are battling Crohn's and colitis. As MICAH QUINN explains now, this walk was very personal for the two fundraisers.
Gary Mason and Tracy Pollock are both from Wetaskiwin, Alberta, and they started walking at the edge of the Saskatchewan and Alberta border near a small town called Walsh. They did this in support of the Gutsy Walk put on by Crohn's and Colitis Canada, with Mason fundraising over $8,000 for the walk.
And we followed Highway 3 all the way through Medicine Hat, Tabor, Lethbridge, Fort Macleod, Pincher Creek, and then ended west of Coleman on the BC border. That's a total of 376 kilometers.
Mason says he did this walk to raise awareness for people that are newly diagnosed with Crohn's or colitis.
And really kind of support them and saying it's not necessarily a death sentence. You can still go out and do really extraordinary things.
For Tracy Pollock, this walk was personal.
Not only as a Crohn's and colitis survivor, but also as a woman whose life has been spent, taking care of others. I wanted even women to know that you can do it, that sometimes our life maybe gets put on hold for others. We can go out there and we can do some pretty big things.
You can still make a donation to Mason's fundraising page until the end of September, and all of the funding will go towards supporting Crohn's and colitis research. For Bridge City News, I'm MICAH QUINN.
The Chinook Regional Hospital Foundation announced its 2020 truck raffle winner yesterday, and the winner was Jessica Hoffman from Coaldale. Congratulations. The foundation sold 8,000 tickets with over $150,000 raised. Shauna Lamb from the Chinook Regional Hospital Foundation says the money raised from the raffle will go towards the many programs and equipment needed for the Chinook Regional Hospital.
And so we would call it the priority projects. So we give to whatever the greatest needs are. This can include really particular pieces of equipment. This can include special projects or programs like children and adolescent mental health. So we basically have an ongoing assessment of what the priority is. In the past, few years, mental health has been a massive focus of that, and we've been able to offer over $1 million of donor dollars towards the renovation of that project.
For more information, you can visit the Chinook Regional Hospital Foundation's website. Canadians love hockey, and here in Lethbridge, we really love our Lethbridge Hurricanes. Now, the business side of hockey, however, is struggling, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. Lethbridge City Council voted to allow the Canes to defer its 2020 maintenance fee for the NMAC Centre. Now, the WHL season is anticipated to start on December 4th, and the club still doesn't know if they'll be able to have fans and what challenges still lie ahead for them economically.
With this deferral from the city, that's a big payment off of our backs. It's going to be a struggle to get through the season, whatever that looks like if we do play. So, we'll just have to be very careful and cognizant of what we're doing and operate as lean as we can and capitalize on our opportunities when we can. We've had a great buy-in for our season tickets for this year, and I think everybody has the hope that we're going to play still, which is fantastic. So as well as we've seen some real good interest in renewals of the advertising, as well as some new advertisers coming forth that want to step up and support the team.
Council voted unanimously to forgive the fee, which totaled close to $167,000 for the year. An anti-racism protest in Red Deer over the weekend turned violent. Video footage from City TV Edmonton shows counter-protesters shoving demonstrators. No charges were laid, but the RCMP opened an investigation to get to the bottom of what happened. Alberta's Justice Minister, Casey Medieu, told reporters that acts like these are unacceptable.
Violence and threats of violence at peaceful protests are unacceptable, period. All Albertans, regardless of race, religion, or creed, have the right to live their lives peacefully. And I denounce any instance of bigotry and intolerance. And I have said that I will not tolerate this as our Justice Minister and Solicitor General.
Alberta RCMP are asking witnesses of the event to come forward. The leader of the Green Party in British Columbia says calling an election during a pandemic is irresponsible and unnecessary. Sonia Furstenau says BC Premier John Horgan is putting the interests of himself and the NDP ahead of the people of BC.
We are now headed into what is a completely unnecessary election. I did meet with the Premier on Friday, reiterated that Adam and I, as a caucus, are absolutely prepared to put the best interests of British Columbians first and foremost, especially at a time when people are worried about their kids being back in school, when people are worried about their jobs, when people are worried about their housing. This is not a time when we put the interests of a political party ahead of the British Columbians who need to know that we are here to serve them.
British Columbians will be going to the polls on October the 24th. More than 126,000 Canadians have now recovered from COVID-19. Symptoms are fever, cough, and shortness of breath. Many people who've recovered say they continue to feel debilitating symptoms. A group in Oakville, Ontario is calling themselves the COVID long haulers. They're urging the federal government to keep track of people who continue to suffer instead of labeling them as simply recovered.
The government has dropped the ball, and they need to sort of regroup and follow this cohort of people, because this could become potentially a long-term economic battle when, you know, there's many thousands of people. We're already almost 4,000 people, and I just started the group a couple months ago. And if we're all needing benefits, then this is going to be, you know, a drain on our economics and on the economy. You know, we're all going to need to have help financially if we can't return back to work. And we're not going to be able to return back to work if we don't have any kind of rehabilitation set up.
More information on the COVID long haulers can be found on their Facebook support group page. Conservative members of Parliament met behind closed doors ahead of the return to the House of Commons for tomorrow's throne speech. While the Liberal government wants a hybrid model in which MPs can attend virtually or in person, the Tories have raised concern about how virtual votes will be conducted.
I think that there has been and will continue to be an abundance of caution to ensure that members of Parliament are safe, that the staff, that the precinct is safe. So I feel satisfied that everyone has the right motives in terms of making sure that safety is paramount. So I feel confident. You know, we've offered some very positive and I think realistic solutions to voting in person whereby safety can be respected. I think that there's still a lot of kinks that would have to be worked out, and you know, schools are resuming. There's a lot that's resuming. We have to be able to continue life in this COVID crisis and do it in a safe way, and I think that includes for parliamentarians.
Ottawa announced today that it will be joining a global vaccine procurement program and an international vaccine sharing initiative. The federal government is continuing its efforts to have access to a COVID-19 vaccine as soon as one is proven to be safe and effective. Canada will announce how much it will pledge to the procurement program by the end of the week. Officials say Canada is also joining the COVAX facility. It is a program linking low and middle income countries to ensure access to COVID-19 vaccines are not limited to just countries which can afford to purchase them. Canada's Chief Public Health Officer, Dr. Theresa Tam, says we may see a dramatic surge of coronavirus cases in Canada unless people limit contact with others in the coming days. Federal Health Minister Patty Hajdu urged people to think carefully before accepting invitations to social gatherings.
Over the past 7 days, an average of 1,058 cases were reported daily, compared to 380 cases reported daily at the time of our last update in mid-August. This acceleration in epidemic growth is concerning, and the situation will continue to escalate further unless public health and individual protective measures are strengthened.
The Justice Centre for Constitutional Freedoms is threatening to sue the federal government. The group wants Ottawa to relax the current mandatory quarantine restrictions for people traveling internationally. Canada has a mandatory 14-day quarantine on all international travelers to Canada. Now, the Justice Centre says the current requirements make no allowances for people with no symptoms or for people who've tested negative for COVID-19. James Kitchen is one of the lawyers at the Justice Centre for Constitutional Freedoms, and he joins me now from Calgary. James, have you reached out yet to the federal government? And if so, what has the response been like?
We've sent a letter, no response yet. We've sent lots of letters before and don't receive responses from government, so we're not overly surprised. We still hope to receive a response, but if not, that's what the court's there for.
Now, you say that restricting someone's freedom who is asymptomatic or who tested negative is not connected to a legitimate public health objective. Can you explain?
You know, what that comes down to is the fact that people who are asymptomatic or who have demonstrated that they're not infectious because they've had a negative test, there's no public health threat. And if there's no public health threat, then there's no legitimate reason at all to be taking away their civil liberties. We have to have a connection between the actual public health threat and the removal of civil liberties, or we're not acting in a constitutional manner.
Now, if you don't hear back from the federal government, what's the next step for you?
We may hear nothing, but we also may come October 1st, and there's a variation in the quarantine order, right? Because the current one expires September 30th. So if we get to October 1st and the new quarantine order relaxes the restrictions, then great. But if not, then off to court we go.
That was James Kitchen, lawyer with the Justice Centre for Constitutional Freedoms, joining me from Calgary. The COVID-19 pandemic is throwing a wrench into the plans of Canadian snowbirds as they consider whether or not to spend the winter lockdown in Arizona or Florida or snowed in here on this side of the border. Health experts caution that infection rates are considerably higher in the United States. Most snowbirds tend to be older and more likely to have underlying health conditions that put them at greater risk of COVID-19 complications. Residents in Halifax and many along the Nova Scotia eastern shore are being warned to stay away from the coastline as Hurricane Teddy is making its way toward Atlantic Canada. A storm surge bringing waves up to 10 meters high and winds up to 100 kilometers an hour expected to hit by Wednesday.
So as of right now, the storm is still about just over 500 kilometers to the south of Halifax. It is moving in this direction at about 45 kilometers per hour. And what we expect is that the storm is going to make a slight turn towards the northeast into the overnight hours and reach the eastern shore of Nova Scotia during the morning hours of Wednesday.
Tropical storm Beta made landfall on the Texas coast southwest of Houston. The National Hurricane Center says it was packing winds of around 80 kilometers an hour. Streets in Houston were flooded with vehicles trapped in the water.
She got stuck on this street right here, and she drifted over to a middle school parking lot.
And she's in her car?
She's in a car.
I mean, this is a dangerous situation.
This is dangerous right here. So we got to lift the trucks and stuff. I'm going to kayak down and put her on the kayak and walk her back in.
European leaders have warned the Trump administration that its claim to have the authority to reimpose the UN-mandated sanctions on Iran has no effect in law. Our foreign affairs expert Lisa Daftari says this is setting up a clash that could lead to Washington potentially imposing sanctions on its European allies.
When we're looking at reports telling us that the Iranians are on the 1 yard line when it comes to having a nuclear weapon, how can the Europeans stand behind that and to maintain that they want to keep normalized relations with the Iranian regime, that they do not want to punish the Iranian regime, that they do not want to starve the Iranian regime and stop them from having a nuclear weapon? This puts the Europeans in a very awkward place, but at the same time, it puts the Americans in a very awkward place to go at this alone.
Catch the full interview with our foreign affairs expert Lisa Daftari discussing the Iranian nuclear threat. That's coming up later in our program. It was cloudy for the first official day of fall, but nice and warm, and that trend will continue for much of the week. Full weather details are coming right up. We had some clouds mixed with sunshine today. Not bad for the first official day of autumn. Tonight, there's a slight chance of showers developing with a low near 5. Tomorrow, mainly cloudy with a high expected near 23. Thursday, the clouds should clear out with a high near 20. Friday, mainly sunny but slightly cooler at 17 degrees. A nice weekend is shaping up so far. Expect a few clouds at 20 on Saturday, a mixture of sun and cloud and 22 for Sunday. Monday, mainly cloudy with a high near 24 degrees. Looking at the almanac, the average high for this time of year is 19 degrees with an average low of 4. The highest temperature on this date was recorded in 1994 at 31 degrees, and the record low was -5 in 2000. Sunrise was at 7:18, sunset at 7:29. Looking at the national forecast for tomorrow now, a special weather statement has been issued by Environment Canada for both Victoria and Vancouver. Expect heavy rain and a high of 16 in Victoria, rain and 17 for Vancouver on Wednesday. Just a few clouds and 21 is on tap for Edmonton. A mixture of sun and cloud and 21 as well for Calgary tomorrow. A good chance of showers and 20 for Regina. Mainly sunny and 20 as well for Saskatoon. A slight chance of rain and 18 for Winnipeg. Partly cloudy and 24 degrees for Toronto tomorrow. Just a few clouds and 22 for Ottawa. Overcast and 23 for Montreal on Wednesday. In Atlantic Canada, expect heavy rain and 18 in Fredericton, New Brunswick. The tropical cyclone statement and a tropical storm watch is still in effect for both Halifax, Nova Scotia and Charlottetown, PEI. Expect rain, heavy winds, and high of 16 in Halifax. Pretty much the same picture and 17 degrees for Charlottetown. And in St. John's, Newfoundland, expect rain or drizzle and high of 19 degrees for tomorrow. The union representing Canadian auto workers reached a deal with the Ford Motor Company. Union President Jerry Diaz says the $1.95 billion will be invested in Ford's Canadian plants, including $1.8 billion toward the production of 5 electric vehicles in Oakville, Ontario, and an engine contract that could create new jobs in Windsor.
As we know, when I selected Ford to be the target, that we had no product for the Oakville assembly plant, as Ford announced the Edge would come to at the end of its production schedule. So we were determined to ensure that we solidified a product for our Oakville plant. I think it's fair to say today that as an organization, we hit a home run.
After settling with Ford, Unifor will now begin negotiations with GM and Fiat Chrysler. Friends of Canadian Broadcasting is calling on Parliament to restrain social media platforms from distributing harmful or hateful content. The lobby group's executive director says courts should penalize platforms that knowingly spread harmful content. Daniel Bernhard made the comment shortly after his group released a research paper that argues social media platforms are not passive or neutral when it comes to content distribution. Facebook did not immediately comment on the research paper or Bernhard's remarks. Stats Canada says the price of new homes saw the biggest monthly increase last month in more than 3 years. The federal agency says prices were up 0.5 percentage point, in part to record high lumber prices amid a shortage caused by the pandemic. It says home buyers are also bidding up the prices of new homes, competing over a low inventory of new houses on the market, particularly in Ottawa and Montreal. Microsoft is buying the company behind the popular video games Doom, Fallout, and The Elder Scrolls. The software giant said it will pay $7.5 billion for ZeniMax Media, the parent company of video game publisher Bethesda Softworks. Microsoft said it's buying the company to beef up its Xbox Game Pass game subscription service, which has over 15 million subscribers. Microsoft has new consoles debuting on November 10th, the Xbox Series and stripped-down Series S version. It will be competing against Sony's new PlayStation 5 console. Now, here's a look at today's markets. The TSX was up 161 points on the day to 16,142. The Dow was up 140 points to 27,288. The S&P 500 was up 34 points to 3315. And the Nasdaq was up 184 points on the day to finish at 19,963. Oil was up 29 cents to $39.60 per barrel. Natural gas was up a cent to $1.85. Gold was down a cent to $1,900.20 an ounce. And silver was down 2 cents to $24.38 an ounce. Wheat is at $237 per metric ton, barley is at $235, canola is at $5.25, and corn is at $255 per metric ton. Live cattle were down 23 cents to $106.48, feeder cattle were down $1.63 to $140.63, and lean hogs were up $2.73 to $68.33. The Canadian dollar was up slightly on the day to 75.17 US. Recapping one of our top stories this hour, the Alberta government announced today that licensed childcare programs will be receiving a funding boost. Minister of Children's Services Rebecca Schultz says the $87 million initiative will help childcare centres, preschools, and approved family day homes continue to keep children safe during the COVID-19 pandemic. The Trump administration says it will be slapping more sanctions on Iran because Iran now has enough material to build a nuclear weapon. Our foreign affairs expert Lisa Daftari says Iran's president will not put up with bullying from the United States and would give a crushing response. More of those details are coming up. But first, here's a look what's happening in and around your community.
Here is your Bridge City News community calendar. Lethbridge Arts Days 2020 is taking place September 24th to the 27th. This is an annual celebration held in conjunction with provincial and national culture days. This year's events and activities will be available online, as well as in person with physical distancing requirements being observed. Connect with artists in our community and come celebrate the arts in Lethbridge. For more information, visit artslethbridge.org. The Center for Suicide Prevention is hosting their third annual Run for Life on Sunday, September 27th. Run for Life is a virtual event this year. Anyone who is passionate about suicide prevention is welcome to join for a virtual journey from darkness into light. Walk or run to remember your loved one and raise awareness for suicide prevention. For details, visit Center for Suicide Prevention Facebook page and follow the events link. Bring your lunch and enjoy beautiful live music at the same time. Come out October 2nd to the first Friday Lunch and Listen concert series featuring performances by the University of Lethbridge Conservatory of Music in CASA's community room beginning 12:15 p.m. and ending at 1. First Friday events are an initiative brought to you by the Heart of Our City Committee. For a full listing of upcoming events, visit firstfridaylethbridge.com. And that's your Bridge City News community calendar.
A new report says the United States is slapping sanctions related to more than 20 people and entities involved in Iran's nuclear, missile, and conventional arms programs. Joining me now to discuss this in more detail is our foreign affairs expert, Lisa Daftari, joining me once again from Los Angeles. Lisa, a senior U.S. official says this will help put more teeth behind previous UN sanctions on Tehran. Apparently, Iran has enough material to build a nuclear weapon by the end of the year. And this is not good news for us here in the Western world.
You'd think that the news that Iran is even closer to a nuclear weapon than previously thought would get at least all of this country in the United States and the rest of the Western world on the same page regarding Iran sanctions, but that hasn't been the case. We have opposition to the sanctions here in the United States, as well as the European Union, who has voiced opposition to the sanctions, saying that they are illegal to snap back these sanctions. The whole point of these sanctions, as was said by Donald Trump in the White House, is to put targeted sanctions on the right entities, on the right industries within Iran, meaning that this will have less of an effect on the mainstream economy as possible. It's impossible to say that it will have no effect on the mainstream economy, but to the extent that they can help it, they'd like these sanctions to only target the industries that relate to weaponry, the military, cybersecurity, etc., and for it to truly put pressure on members of the regime that are responsible for the nuclear program, for human rights violations, and so on.
In response to the sanctions, Iran's President Rouhani says his country would give a crushing response to America's bullying. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, the Iranian regime is not going to take this one sitting down. They are flexing their muscles yet again and saying not will they only retaliate against the United States for these sanctions, but they will also retaliate to avenge the killing of shadowy commanders Qasem Soleimani that took place back in January. If you remember, the United States took out this commander who was responsible for the deaths of many Western military personnel in Iraq, in Syria, etc. So the Iranian regime is still flexing its muscles, saying that if these sanctions are put back into place, they will retaliate.
Iran's currency hit a record low this week after the Trump administration says the UN sanctions have been reimposed. In fact, the value has lost 49% to the US dollar throughout the year, including 30% since June.
Yes, the Iranian economy has been tumbling down for many reasons, but mainly because of the sanctions and because of the uncertainty. I speak to a lot of Iranians on a daily basis. I interview them about how the economy is doing, how they view the U.S. Foreign policy with regards to Iran, how they view their own regime. And overwhelmingly, the Iranian people are understanding more and more that these sanctions are meant to starve and strangle the regime and not meant to hurt the people of Iran. If you recall, in November, there was massive demonstrations throughout the country, all sorts of people coming out onto the streets from Tehran, meaning the urbanites, all the way to the rural areas within Iran. And Many of them were what we call the bazaris, which are the men who work in the bazaar, who are who are really the main or the central economy of Iran. There's a triangular economic system there, and the people who are most in the place where the sanctions will bite, they're the ones coming out onto the streets and saying, we understand that this is a means to an end. We understand that this is foreign policy meant to crumble the regime, and we are on board to the extent that this will lead us to a better future for the Iranian people.
Now, European leaders have warned the U.S. that its claim to have the authority to reimpose the UN-mandated sanctions on Iran has no effect in law. Lisa, this is setting up a major clash that could lead to Washington potentially imposing sanctions against its European allies?
Yes, it might be a unilateral approach to the pressure campaign against the Iranian regime. If you recall, in May of 2018, Donald Trump fulfilled his promise of withdrawing from the nuclear deal between the United States and 5 other countries with the Iranians, and the Europeans were very much opposed to Donald Trump withdrawing. The Europeans find themselves in a very awkward position. On the one hand, they want to benefit from the economic prosperity of having relations with Iran. They want to be able to go in and out and to have the imports, exports, and have the access to the Iranian economy. On the other hand, what we call these inconvenient truths. What are we looking at? Well, we're looking at reports telling us that the Iranians are on the 1 yard line when it comes to having a nuclear weapon. How can the Europeans stand behind that and to maintain that they want to keep normalized relations with the Iranian regime, that they do not want to punish the Iranian regime, that they do not want to starve the Iranian regime and stop them from having a nuclear weapon? This puts the Europeans in a very awkward place, but at the same time, it puts the Americans in a very awkward place to go at this alone.
Bahrain's Interior Ministry says it was the target of an Iranian-backed terror plot, Lisa. The country managed to thwart the plans of terrorists, which allegedly received funding from Iran and members of the terrorist Revolutionary Guard Corps.
Yes, so it looks like Bahrain is the target once again. If you recall, Bahrain was the place that housed the peace talks with Jared Kushner and Donald Trump leading the deal of the century, the offer that was made to the Palestinian people. It was hosted by Bahrain last year. At the same time, Bahrain was the place where the U.S. assets were housed before they went over to kill shadowy commander Qasem Soleimani. And now, again, Bahrain finds itself in the headlines as they became signatory to the Abraham Accords, normalizing relations between themselves and Israel, along with the United Arab Emirates, just last week. So, Iran is saying, look, you're our new target. You are not with us, you're against us. So now you are. What they tried to do is launch a terror attack to let the Bahrainis know that they should be on alert.
Officials in Sudan are holding a decisive meeting with the United States and the United Arab Emirates over signing a normalization deal with Israel. Explain what that's all about.
Yeah, so this is a continuation of the Abraham Accords. About a month ago, Donald Trump, the White House, announced that they would be normalizing relations. They were brokering the normalizing of relations between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. Just a month later, they announced that Bahrain would be the second country that would add its name to the list of countries normalizing relations between Israel and its Arab neighbors. Now, last Tuesday, there was a signing of what is called the Abraham Accords. This is a peace deal between these two Arab nations and Israel, brokered by the White House. And at the event, which I actually had the humble opportunity to attend, Donald Trump announced that there would be more countries that would be signing on to this deal. This shows a significant shift in the region and a very outside-the-box solution to Middle East peace. For years, it was a myth that was what was just passed down from generation to generation, saying that the only way to Middle East peace would be if the Arabs, the Palestinians, and the Israelis signed a peace deal. And at this moment, we are farther than ever from seeing a peace treaty or any sort of semblance of peace between the Palestinians and the Israelis. But what Donald Trump and Jared Kushner, his son-in-law and an advisor in the Middle East, were able to do is to strike a deal between the United Arab Emirates and the Israelis, which brings the Arab world closer to Israel and modernizes the Middle East in a way that was never thought possible. So now we're seeing Sudan and hopefully many other countries be on the short list of nations that will soon be signatory to these accords.
The U.S. military is sending a half a dozen armored vehicles on a 90-day mission to reinforce its troops in eastern Syria. Lisa, that is less than a month after 4 U.S. soldiers were injured during an altercation with Russian troops in the area.
Yes, this is a reassessment of foreign policy vis-a-vis Syria in the region. The White House has said that we are going to resubmit ourselves because ISIS is a much bigger threat than previously thought. When the U.S. diminished its presence in Syria, in Iraq, the list goes on. President Trump once believed or rumored to be a pro-war president is actually the opposite. He's scaling back U.S. assets in these countries, in these conflicts where it seems like there is no end to. But right now, there is a direct threat to U.S. assets and to the U.S. directly in Syria, and that is why we will be increasing our presence there.
The Chinese Communist Party has defended its system of internment camps for many ethnic minorities in Xinjiang. Now, a white paper also revealed some details as to the breadth of its labor program. It said an average of 1.29 million workers have gone through vocational training between 2014 and 2019.
Yeah, more news out of China. It looks like, the antennas are up. People are really focusing in on the human rights abuses coming out of China. These camps where individuals are, humiliated, who are working very, very hard lives, that are mutilated in many cases, that are raped, that are, and the list goes on. There's now international pressure to investigate further, to look at these camps. I know H&M, which is a major clothing chain throughout the world, has pulled out its deal with a Chinese factory because of its connection to these camps. And I think more companies will now have the backbone or to have the confidence to do the same, to fight at least economically, if not in any other way, to show the Chinese that we mean business.
A leak of documents from leading banks revealed a massive North Korean scheme to evade sanctions by laundering money through U.S. banks. The reports revealed at least $174 million over several years through banks including J.P. Morgan Chase.
Yes, this is a phenomenal story. I mean, to think that we are not only unable to curb the rogue behavior of the North Koreans, we know nothing about them, but at the same time, they're using U.S. banks to money launder, to cover up their shady business. This comes as a surprise to many. I think J.P. Morgan will have a lot of questions to answer in the coming days. But the answer as to how they were doing this, it was through, as you guessed, Chinese companies and dual use companies. So they were able to hide the actual laundering through other businesses and the way that they operate.
A report by the Times of Israel says Honduras is set to move its embassy to Jerusalem by the end of the year. But Lisa, only if the pandemic allows it to happen.
This is a wonderful, wonderful story. Again, coming out of the Middle East, we have some good news. As you know, the U.S. moved its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. That move was then followed by the Guatemalans. Over the weekend, the Armenians opened a consulate in Israel, and now we have Honduras announcing that they will do the same, and Israel in turn will open up a consulate in their country. So it's wonderful to hear that we are facing, this is geopolitics. This is modernity. This is countries moving forward. And to be honest, this is the right move. This is countries that will gain access to Israeli technology, perhaps a COVID vaccine, where we know that the Israelis are on the front lines of coming up with one. They'll have access to apps and medical technology and many other things. So this is wonderful news, not just for Israel, not just for Honduras, not just for the Middle East, but really for the world at large. This is a wonderful, wonderful, feel-good story.
Our foreign affairs expert, Lisa Daftari, thanks again for joining me from Los Angeles. Throughout generations, people have probed the Holy Scriptures in search of meaning, purpose, solace, and forgiveness. It's also the ultimate source of timeless leadership principles. Joining me now to talk about it is Joe Turnham, the Economic Development Director for East Alabama, also author of the book Leading from Our Knees. Joe, welcome to Bridge City News.
It's great to be with you, Hal.
Now, do you think our recent challenges in both your country, in the U.S., and here in Canada have caused us to really look at leadership a little bit differently?
Without question. And I think, most people think successful leadership breeds peace and tranquility, but often it doesn't. And I think leading amidst chaos and destruction and pandemic and economic calamity is probably one of the greatest challenges of leadership. And I think it rattles the faith of those who count on their leaders to solve problems. And many times these problems are beyond the scope of simple solutions. And that's when we measure leadership with a little different yardstick, as you would say.
Or here in Canada, meter stick, that's right. Now, do we expect a little too much from those who lead us? Our mayors, our premiers, governors, like south of the border? What do you think?
Hal, I don't think we expect too much of them. I do think that perhaps we are maybe overconfident or over demanding in what we think the results can be from leadership. We talk about in the book a little bit that many times leadership is not making a good or a bad choice, but making the lesser choices that hurt the fewest or perhaps give us a chance for hope. And I think in these days that we have to allow leaders to make a few mistakes, because they will make mistakes, and many times they're making important measurements of do we reopen society at a risk of increasing infections, or do we let people lose jobs or get people sick? And these are not easy decisions for leaders. And I think that people sometimes can get cruel and partisan when leaders don't make decisions that they totally agree with, when in fact, if we're constituents of faith, that's when we need to ramp up prayers, and we need to hope that our leaders are getting good advice. In the scripture, leaders and kings and judges, they relied on prophets and advisors, and so I think that we have to look for our leaders to be getting the best advice that they can get in these days.
Joe, as the Economic Development Director for East Alabama, what have you seen in your present or past work with pastors, heads of state, or community leaders?
Well, that every leadership situation sometimes is situational. And I think a lot of leaders are in situations they've never been in before. I mean, in economic development, we have massive job losses. We have things are getting personal. Places with very high economic standards, people are going to food banks. So you have to recalculate. I think you look more internally. No person is left behind. You have to kind of recalibrate how you make decisions and how you prioritize decisions. I know economic developers are looking to, sometimes instead of recruiting, we have to rescue. And I think that's been a big focus. And I think as pastors or leaders of faith, we have to look at maybe not giving the solutions, but giving hope and getting in the right direction, the right frame of mind, so that we can come out the other end of this situation that we're in.
Hey, Joe, sometimes there are no right answers to complex challenges. How do effective leaders really navigate times of uncertainty?
Well, I think that good leaders exemplify humility, that sometimes the issues are beyond them. They reach out for help. They admit mistakes. They're able to change direction. There's nothing wrong in leadership with changing directions. If a policy or perhaps the situations change, leaders can change. And I think asking those that follow you, whether you're an elected official or whether you're just a community leader, that, hey, we need to recalibrate today. We need to change directions. Maybe we got the data wrong. I think those are the kinds of changes that people appreciate leaders making in these days.
Biblical leaders were far from perfect, Joe. We all know that. Why does God often choose people who seem the least likely people to lead?
Well, it's throughout the scriptures. I mean, you look at, whether people were grinding grain or whether they were fishermen or whether they were tending sheep. I mean, God plucked out people of really modest means that never went to leadership school. And the leaders of today, sometimes their job is not to lead for a long time, but to lead through a certain situation. And I think leaders make mistakes. I mean, David was a man after the heart of God, but he numbered Israel. He committed adultery. He was an accessory even to murder, but he became a man after God's own heart. And the brothers of Joseph sold him into slavery and deprived their own flesh and blood of opportunity. And in the end, Joseph, when he's dying, looks around. He said, "You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good." So, I think leaders today, we need to pray for them, but I think also we need to allow good leaders to make some mistakes.
So in your opinion, then, what are some of the core attributes that make for a good leader?
Humility. Always look for humility. I think in leaders that have a heart of love and service, and you can discern that in the way that they conduct themselves. And we say here in the Deep South, where I'm from, that we want leaders that will be cross bearers and not crown wearers. That people that seek to do leadership because they know it's a duty, a lift. It oftentimes brings you under scrutiny and burdens. People that run for office, or people that want the trappings of success or influence, or that need the affirmation of power, are usually people that I know will not last or be effective leaders. But a good thing is always humility and people that even have a sense of humor, that are able to be self-deprecating, because I think in leadership that it will overwhelm anyone. It doesn't matter if you're leading at the local or the national level. And I think that leaders also that seek the right advice, and leaders that have that heart for service. And I think it bleeds through everything they do and say.
You talk about being from the Deep South. I can hear that strong Southern accent. When I speak with you, can you hear my strong Canadian accent?
I can. It's very beautiful.
Okay. Why do you feel a real kinship with many of the characters and situations in the Bible?
I have been a political candidate. I've won some races, lost some races. I have been on the edge of disaster. I have met kings, queens, leaders, presidents over many administrations, and have been almost driven to my knees in trying to understand leadership. And the Holy Spirit spoke to me to write this particular book because I think leadership is lonely. Leadership can destroy families. I've seen many people get destroyed financially, legally, and otherwise being in leadership. And so I felt like God wanted me to take these lessons of Scripture and offer them to people, because we're all leaders, and if we're people of faith, God will call us to leadership. Jonah didn't want to judge the people. Are you going to go to Nineveh or Tarshish? He didn't want to go in the right direction. But if you're a person of faith and God calls you to lead, he will pursue you until you answer that call. So, I think all of us at some point in faith will be called, whether it's to lead in our own families, which is the greatest leadership calling of anyone, to leading at in a network in Canada, or leading, a group of scouts. I mean, I think leadership, we're all blips of eternity. And I think, every action that we do will be measured in the fire of heaven. And I think that when we do things in the right heart and the right mind, and we love each other and we seek forgiveness, and I think in the United States today, we're seeking to understand. Daniel in the Old Testament set his heart to understand. And I think that leaders today, whether and you ask me a quality of a great leader, is leaders that want to understand and hear the opposing voices, and bring people to the banquet that have never sat there and hear their perspective. And I think for us to heal, especially in America in these days, love, listening, learning, humility, finding places of where we can agree and de-escalate. That's when I think the Holy Spirit begins to work through situations.
Now, in each of your 365 entries, you provide a verse from the Bible and a takeaway lesson. Can you maybe cite an example or two?
Sure. I mean, the title of the book, Leading from Our Knees, is actually from the book of Luke, and it's Christ setting the example of leadership. And it was Christ went into a mountain one night to pray, and it says he prayed all night. And when he descended from the mountain, he chose his 12 apostles. Big decision he had to make. Son of God, creator of heaven and earth. What does he do? He prays over his decisions, and I think that's a big takeaway. And you know, the book is a read through scriptures from Genesis to Revelation, and we can see from the prophets and the prophetesses and the disciples and apostles, but Christ himself. He knew when to cleanse the temple and when to be quiet in front of a Pilate, and he can show us in our leadership journeys today how to lead a holy life and a holy leadership journey.
Jesus provided the best example of leadership, Joe. What do you see as some of the qualities that Jesus had and demonstrated that we rarely see in our leaders today?
Well, Jesus knew what his mission was, and he knew that that was going to be a lonely leadership journey. He knew he was going to be tempted. Leaders are tempted, and he went to the temple. Satan probably didn't offer him. Satan probably said, "There'll be no more plagues. There'll be no more death. There'll be no more tears if you follow me." And in Christ, that was a hard decision, but he quoted the scriptures. He knew the scriptures, and I think Christ also he loved people into the fold, but he also knew that leadership. There's nothing wrong with telling people of faith that there will be suffering in your journey. You know, I mean. I also believe in prosperity and that people of faith can be rewarded by following the word of God. But if we are called to leadership, we will suffer. And Christ was a suffering servant. And I think that, I have not seen nor ear heard, nor has ever entered into the heart of any man the things that God has prepared for those that love him. And I think that if we as people of faith in this earthly journey and this leadership journey that many of us are given, if we will keep our eyes on the eternal prize, and that if we will love others as we love ourselves, and we forgive 7 times 7, and that God will lift us up and he will use us in the things that we do, and Christ is the perfect example of that.
Joe, can a person be a good leader and yet be an unbeliever?
Absolutely. And I think that there's certain principles of leadership. I mean, you don't have to be a person of faith necessarily to be humble or to be caring or to love. But we also understand that the kings and queens and princes and presidents are but the footstool of God. And many times, we leaders think that they're affecting the outcome of eternity, but God orders the steps. I think he orders the steps of the faithful. I think he orders the steps of unbelievers. He's the God of all circumstances. So, yeah, sure. I think that anyone is used in leadership, and people can have the right heart, not necessarily know the heart of God.
So what advice would you offer parents about their own role in leadership within their families?
Be available. Listen, find times to put the electronics down, to do the simple things, to take out grandma's recipe. I think, in the quarantine here in the United States, I feel that it was God's gift to us to have to spend time with families. We're not on planes, trains, automobiles. We're forced to be together. That teenager that we can't have a discussion with, there are times that God's opened the door to have that walking down the street, or perhaps pierce the heart of a relative that is astray. And so, let's look at the tough times that we faced with the pandemic as almost opportunities. And I really believe even here in North America, where we're having great social disturbance, that it could be a setup for a huge spiritual awakening in our country, where love and forgiveness and understanding and a search for justice and mercy prevail all that we do. Just as the genocide in Rwanda forced people, Hutus and Tutsis, to sit down and to understand, how can this happen? How can we heal? How can we confess? How can we make it better? And, you know, sometimes a setback is a setup for God to work great miracles.
So how do you hope readers will use your book, Leading from Our Knees, and what kind of takeaways will there be for non-leaders?
Well, I think they're timeless principles. You know, you can read the Christian texts, and they, you know, they're about, you know, love and being accountable, and there are a lot of great principles there, just as there are in many faiths, in Buddhism and Islam and other religions. But I think if you look at it, that you will see that many of timeless principles that many generations have seen from great leaders are really in the Old and New Testaments of the Judeo-Christian texts.
Joe Turnham, author of the book, Leading from Our Knees, thanks a lot for your time today.
Thank you, Hal. God bless.
On behalf of all of us here at BCN, I'm Hal Roberts. God bless, and thanks so much for watching.